A cry in the cold. The icy November wind howled through the darkened city streets, rattling the few remaining leaves that clung stubbornly to barren branches. Officer Luke Callahan pulled his patrol car into the dimly lit alleyway behind Street Mark's homeless shelter, his breath fogging against the windshield. The call had come through dispatch about a disturbance, a break-in, possibly vandalism. Just another long, cold night in a city that had seen its share of despair. He stepped out of the car, pulling his jacket tighter around him as he scanned the area. The shelter's entrance was illuminated by a flickering street lamp, casting long, distorted shadows against the worn brick walls. Broken glass crunched under his boots as he approached the doorway, his trained eyes taking in the scene. The donation bin had been overturned, its contents, coats, gloves, canned food, scattered haphazardly across the sidewalk. But it wasn't just looting. Boxes were ripped open, their contents deliberately destroyed. It felt personal. "Officer," a voice called out. Luke turned to see the shelter's manager, a wiry man in his 50s with glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. His name tag read Daniel Porter. "Mr. Porter," Luke greeted, his voice steady. "Walk me through what happened." Daniel ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "It's the third time this month," he muttered, gesturing at the mess. "They took the food, medicine, even the winter coats for the kids, but it's the damage they left behind. It's like they wanted to hurt us." Luke frowned, taking in the shattered windows, the gutted boxes, the slashed sleeping bags. This wasn't just a robbery. It was destruction for destruction's sake. "You see anyone?" Luke asked, pulling out his notepad. Daniel shook his head. "They come in the dead of night. Whoever it is, they know how to stay out of sight." Luke was about to radio for backup when a sudden noise caught his attention, a soft rustling sound near his patrol car. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. The city had taught him to stay on edge. Moving toward the vehicle, he noticed the passenger door was slightly ajar. His gut tightened. He knew he had locked it. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, he reached for his flashlight and shone the beam inside. And that's when he saw her, a small, trembling figure curled up on the back seat, trying to make herself invisible beneath his spare jacket. A little girl, no older than 9, with tangled dark hair and eyes far too weary for her young face. She flinched slightly at the light, but didn't try to run. Luke crouched beside the open door, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hey there," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You okay?" She didn't answer. Her wide dark eyes stayed locked on his, unblinking, as if trying to gauge whether he was a threat. Her hands clutched the fabric of his jacket like it was the only thing keeping her from vanishing into the cold. Luke's chest tightened. He had seen plenty of kids in bad situations, but there was something about this one. Something different. She wasn't just lost. She was alone in the way only a child without a home could be. "What's your name, sweetheart?" He tried again. Still silence. Luke exhaled slowly, lowering his voice even more. "It's okay. You don't have to be scared. My name's Luke. I'm a police officer." He gestured toward his badge, hoping the familiarity of authority might offer some comfort. The girl's lips parted slightly, and in the smallest whisper, she finally spoke. "Lily." Luke nodded encouragingly. "Lily. That's a beautiful name." He kept his tone warm, reassuring. "Do you have somewhere you're supposed to be?" She hesitated, then shook her head once. "No." That answer made his gut clench. He glanced down at her clothes, thin and worn, but clean. Someone had been taking care of her at some point, but not anymore. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. Lily's grip on the jacket tightened, and her eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't answer, but the raw pain in her expression said enough. "Gone." Luke let out a slow breath. He needed to radio this in, get child services involved. But he also knew how the system worked, how easily kids like Lily fell through the cracks. He had seen it before, kids shuffled from one temporary home to the next, their spirits slowly being chipped away with each move. He reached into the back seat and pulled out his emergency blanket, draping it over her shoulders. "It's freezing out here," he murmured. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Lily didn't resist, but she also didn't move as he started the engine. The heater kicked on, filling the car with much-needed warmth. Still, she sat motionless, her small hands gripping the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. Luke picked up his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Callahan. I've got a juvenile, approximately 9 years old. No guardians present. Requesting child services at my location." A pause. Then the familiar voice of Carla Simmons crackled through. "Copy that. Luke, you okay?" He glanced at Lily, her small frame swallowed by his jacket, her eyes staring out at the darkened city beyond the window. "I don't know, Carla," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. "Something about this feels different." Carla was quiet for a moment before responding. "Hang tight. I'll get someone on it." Luke set the radio down and turned back to Lily. "I promise we're going to figure this out." For the first time, she met his gaze directly. And then, in the smallest, most fragile voice he had ever heard, she whispered, "Can you be my dad?" The words stopped him cold. His heart clenched, a pang of something deep and unfamiliar surging through him. He had dealt with scared kids before, had reassured them, comforted them, even held their hands through rough nights. But no child had ever asked him that. Luke swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Lily," he didn't know what to say. Her lower lip quivered. "Please," she whispered, "take me home with you." A lump formed in his throat. Everything in his training told him what he needed to do. Follow protocol, call child services, let the system handle it. But something in those eyes, in that voice, reached into him and refused to let go. He had never been a father, never thought about becoming one. His life was the job, day in, day out. But sitting here, looking at this lost, desperate little girl, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. And maybe, just maybe, Lily wasn't the only one who needed saving. A promise in the dark. The city was alive in the way only a restless night could make it. Horns blaring in the distance, sirens wailing like ghosts in the wind, the hum of neon signs flickering against the inky sky. But inside Luke Callahan's patrol car, there was only silence. A fragile, aching silence. Lily sat curled in the passenger seat now, no longer hiding in the back like a frightened animal. His oversized jacket still swallowed her small frame, her fingers fidgeting with the blanket he had given her. She hadn't spoken since the whispered plea that had nearly broken him. "Can you be my dad?" Those words still echoed in his head, tangled with a million questions and doubts clawing at his mind. He wasn't a father. He was a cop. A man who spent his days navigating the worst humanity had to offer. He had never thought about having kids, let alone adopting one on a freezing November night. But here she was. Lily. A little girl with nowhere to go, and no one left to fight for her. Luke let out a slow breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter as he pulled onto the main road. He had put in the call to dispatch, requesting Child Protective Services to meet them at the station. It was the right thing to do. The logical thing. Then why did it feel so damn wrong? He glanced over at Lily, studying the way she sat so still, like a ghost in the flesh. The way her eyes stayed fixed on the world outside the window, watching it pass as though she didn't quite belong to it anymore. "Lily," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You doing okay?" She nodded, but it was automatic. Lifeless. A reflex. Luke sighed. He wasn't good at this delicate, careful thing that people did with kids. He was used to giving orders, used to reading the body language of criminals and liars. But Lily wasn't a suspect. She was just a scared kid who had been let down too many times. "You hungry?" he asked. This time, she hesitated. Then, another nod. Good enough. Luke made a quick turn, pulling into a small 24-hour diner tucked between a rundown laundromat and a liquor store. The neon sign buzzed, casting a pale blue glow over the cracked pavement. "Come on," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Let's get some food." Lily hesitated, looking at the door of the diner like it was something dangerous. Then, slowly, she climbed out of the car. The wind cut through the night, making her shiver. Without thinking, Luke reached back and grabbed his jacket from the car, draping it over her shoulders again. She didn't pull away. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and burnt toast. A tired-looking waitress barely glanced up from the counter as Luke guided Lily to a booth near the window. The place was mostly empty, save for a couple of truckers nursing cups of black coffee and an old man staring blankly at a crossword puzzle. Lily slid into the booth across from him, her small hands gripping the edges of the menu like it might disappear at any second. Luke watched her for a moment before setting his own menu down. "Get whatever you want," he told her. "Seriously, anything." She bit her lip, glancing at the laminated pages filled with food she probably hadn't had in a long time. After a moment, she looked up at him, voice barely above a whisper. "Pancakes." Luke grinned. "You got it." The waitress sauntered over, not bothering with pleasantries. "What'll it be?" "Stack of pancakes for her," Luke said, handing over the menus. "And a hot chocolate." The waitress scribbled the order down and turned to Luke. "And you?" "Coffee. Black." The woman nodded and walked off, leaving them in silence again. Lily traced a pattern into the table with her fingertip, the distant neon glow of the sign outside reflecting in her dark eyes. Luke exhaled, leaning back against the worn leather of the booth. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked, his voice careful. Lily's fingers stilled. Then, a long pause. Finally, she looked up at him, and for the first time, she wasn't just staring past him. She was seeing him. "My mom died first," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the diner. Luke sat up straighter, his chest tightening. "She was sick," Lily continued, her voice hollow. "Cancer. We didn't have a house, so we stayed in shelters. She tried really hard, but then she got too tired." Luke clenched his fists under the table. He had seen these stories before. They never got easier. "My dad wasn't around," Lily said. "Mom always told me he was somewhere far away, but I think that meant he didn't want us." A lump formed in Luke's throat, but he swallowed it down. He had no right to speak on behalf of a man he had never met. "After she died, I went to live with my grandpa." Lily hesitated, her fingers gripping the sleeve of his jacket. "He didn't want me either." Luke frowned. "Walter Parker. He's your grandfather." She nodded, her face unreadable. Luke had only gotten the brief report from dispatch about her missing persons case. The file had said Walter Parker was her legal guardian. It hadn't said why she had been living in his house or why she had ended up on the streets. The waitress returned with their food, setting down a plate stacked high with golden pancakes, dripping with syrup. The hot chocolate steamed in its ceramic mug, topped with a generous swirl of whipped cream. Lily blinked at the food like it was a mirage. Luke nodded toward it. "Go ahead, kid." She hesitated for only a second before picking up the fork. The first bite was small, tentative. But the moment the warm, syrupy sweetness hit her tongue, something in her expression shifted. For the first time since he had found her, Lily looked like a kid again. She ate in silence, each bite more eager than the last. Luke watched her, his heart aching at how carefully she chewed, how she never let herself take too big of a mouthful, like she was afraid it might be her last meal for a while. "You don't have to rush," he said softly. Lily slowed slightly but kept eating. Luke sipped his coffee, watching as she devoured the pancakes, taking careful sips of the hot chocolate between bites. They sat like that for a long time, the world outside the diner fading into the background. Finally, when her plate was empty and her cup was nearly drained, she set down her fork with a small sigh. Luke leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Lily," he said gently, "why did you run?" Her eyes flickered with something unreadable before dropping to her lap. "My grandpa." She hesitated. "He never hit me, but he didn't want me there." Luke frowned. "Did he hurt you in any way?" She shook her head. "Not like that." Her voice dropped lower. "But he didn't care if I ate. He didn't care if I was cold. And then one day he told me." She swallowed hard. "He said I wasn't his problem." Luke felt something inside him snap. He had been prepared for a tough case. He had been prepared for bruises, for scars, for the kind of wounds that could be photographed as evidence. But neglect, that was its own kind of cruelty. One that left no marks, only hollow eyes and broken trust. Lily looked up at him again, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard him calling someone. He said he was done. That he was gonna send me away." Her fingers curled into tiny fists. "I didn't want to go back into the system. So I ran." Luke exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had been in this game long enough to know how the system worked. And how, too often, it failed. But as he sat there, watching this tiny girl fight to keep herself from falling apart, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let it fail her. Not this time. Not ever. A system that doesn't care. The diner had quieted down, the hum of conversation fading as the late-night crowd trickled out. The smell of coffee and maple syrup still lingered, wrapping around Luke Callahan like a familiar embrace. Across from him, Lily sat curled into the booth, her empty plate pushed to the side, her small hands wrapped around the now half-empty mug of hot chocolate. Luke had seen his share of neglected kids in his time as a cop, but there was something about Lily that got to him in a way he couldn't shake. Maybe it was the way she looked at him with cautious hope, like she wanted to believe someone could care but didn't quite trust it yet. Maybe it was the way she clutched his old jacket around herself, like it was the first warmth she had felt in a long time. Or maybe, deep down, he just knew. This kid was supposed to be his. But life didn't work that way. There were rules, laws, policies. He couldn't just pick her up and take her home like a stray dog. The system had its way of handling things, even if that way was slow and broken. "Lily," he said gently, breaking the silence. "We have to go to the station." The flicker of fear in her eyes made his gut clench. "I don't want to go," she whispered, curling into herself. "They'll take me." Luke rubbed a hand down his face, exhaustion weighing on him. "They're not going to take you anywhere tonight. You'll stay at the station for now, and we'll figure out the rest." She didn't look convinced. And honestly, neither was he. The station. A temporary shelter. The precinct was quieter than usual when they arrived. It was past midnight now, and the usual chaos of booking and late-night patrol reports had died down to a murmur of voices and the occasional ring of a phone. Carla Simmons, the department's dispatcher and unofficial mom to every cop in the precinct, looked up from her desk as Luke walked in with Lily. She took one look at the little girl wrapped in his oversized jacket and let out a soft sigh. "Well, Dan," she muttered. "I was afraid this was about her." Luke arched an eyebrow. "You know something I don't." Carla nodded, pushing her glasses up her nose and grabbing a folder from her desk. "Lily Parker, reported missing 3 days ago by her grandfather, Walter Parker." She flipped through the pages, shaking her head. No follow-up calls. No real concern. Just filed the report and moved on. "That tell you anything?" Luke clenched his jaw. Yeah, it told him everything. Carla's eyes softened as she looked at Lily. "Hey, sweetheart, you want something to drink? I think we still have some hot cocoa in the break room." Lily hesitated, looking at Luke before giving the smallest nod. "Good call," Luke said, patting her back lightly. "I need to talk to Carla for a minute." As Carla led Lily toward the break room, Luke let out a breath and leaned against the counter. "Tell me everything," he said. Carla sighed. "Her parents are dead. Mother passed away about 6 months ago. No record of the father. She shook her head. She's been bounced between relatives ever since, but no one's kept her longer than a few weeks. It's like they just keep passing her around, hoping someone else will deal with it. Luke's stomach turned. And Walter? Carla's lips pressed into a thin line. Old man barely passed the guardian background check, but since he was the only living relative who stepped up, the court placed her with him. She tapped the file. Now, here's the kicker. He called social services last week, said he wanted to give her back. Like she was some rental he didn't need anymore. Luke's blood boiled, and they let him keep her. Carla gave him a tired look. You know how it works, Luke. They don't remove kids unless there's proof of abuse or neglect. And neglect is harder to prove unless she was found starving or with injuries. Luke ran a hand over his face. He wanted to punch someone. But instead, he took a deep breath and forced himself to focus. She told me he was planning to get rid of her. That's why she ran. Carla sighed. Kids got good instincts. If she hadn't run, she'd probably be in some overcrowded foster home by now. Luke's gut twisted. He glanced toward the break room, where he could see Lily sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup as she stared at the floor. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another kid. This was Lily. And he wasn't going to let her disappear into the system. Fighting the system. The social worker arrived an hour later. Helen Carter, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an expression that rarely softened. She had been doing this job for a long time, long enough to stop believing in happy endings. Luke didn't like her. She stepped into the precinct, adjusting her blazer and glancing around. Officer Callahan, she greeted, offering a brief, impersonal smile. Where's the girl? Luke gestured toward the break room. Drinking hot cocoa, trying to process the fact that her grandfather dumped her like garbage. Helen pursed her lips. I understand this is emotional for you, but I need to remind you that there's a legal process for these situations. Luke crossed his arms. Is that the process where you put her in another temporary home until they get tired of her and send her somewhere else? Helen sighed. I know you don't trust the system, because it fails kids like her all the damn time. She held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something behind her guarded expression. Exhaustion. Maybe even regret. I don't want to take her from you, Officer Callahan, she admitted. But she has no family left, and you're not a guardian. You're a cop who found her in his car. Do you know how hard it would be to place her with you legally? Luke's jaw clenched. Then tell me how. Helen hesitated. The only way is through emergency guardianship, but that requires proving her current guardian is unfit. Luke leaned forward, voice like steel. Walter Parker abandoned her. He is unfit. Helen exhaled, pinching the bridge of her nose. The court needs more than that. Luke's mind raced. What if he waives his rights? Helen blinked. What? If Walter doesn't want her, he can sign away his rights voluntarily. If I get him to do that, can I apply for emergency custody? Helen hesitated, then slowly nodded. It would give you a case, but he'd have to do it willingly, and you'd still need approval from a judge. Luke nodded. Fine. Where is he? Helen frowned. I'm not sure. We haven't been able to reach him since he filed the report. Luke's lips pressed into a thin line. Then I'll find him. Helen sighed. You're really going to do this, aren't you? He looked toward the break room, where Lily sat, small and fragile, but somehow still fighting. Yes, he said quietly. I am. Helen studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, Officer Callahan. Let's see if you can beat the system. Luke turned toward Carla. Get me Walter Parker's last known address. Carla smirked. Already on it. Luke took one last look at Lily. She was watching him now, uncertainty in her eyes. He walked over and crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. Hey kid, he said softly. I'm not leaving you. Lily swallowed hard. Promise. He nodded. I promise. And Luke Callahan never broke a promise, breaking the chains of the past. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, a slow drizzle tapping against the windshield as Luke Callahan pulled his patrol car up to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly, barely illuminating the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Walter Parker's last known address. Luke's hands clenched around the steering wheel, his jaw tightening as he stared at the peeling paint on the motel's exterior. The place reeked of lost souls and broken promises, a place where people went to disappear. But Luke wasn't here to let someone disappear. He was here to make damn sure Walter Parker took responsibility for what he had done. The ghost of a man. Room 114. Luke approached the door, his boots crunching against the gravel. He could hear the low hum of a TV inside, the faint sound of some old Western movie playing in the background. His knuckles rapped against the wood, firm but not aggressive. A long pause. Then slow, shuffling footsteps. The door cracked open, revealing a man who looked like he had aged a decade in a year. Walter Parker stood there, his eyes bloodshot, his gray hair unkempt. The stench of stale liquor clung to him like a second skin. He blinked at Luke, his gaze unfocused. "Officer," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "What do you want?" Luke didn't waste time. "We need to talk." Walter hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Luke into the cramped motel room. Inside, the place was a mess. Empty beer bottles littered the nightstand. An ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts sat on the table, and a half-eaten sandwich lay forgotten on the dresser. Luke didn't sit. He stood, arms crossed, towering over Walter as the older man slumped onto the edge of the bed. "You reported Lily missing," Luke started, his tone sharp. "And then you disappeared." Walter let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. "She ran off," he muttered. "Figured she'd be better off." Luke's temper flared. "You're her legal guardian. You don't just get to figure she'd be better off and wash your hands of her." Walter exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. "You don't get it, officer," he said, his voice quieter now. "I lost my son. He was the only family I had left. And then they brought her to me." And she looked at me with his eyes. His voice cracked. "Every time I saw her, I saw my boy. And it killed me." Luke took a step forward. "So you punish her for it?" Walter flinched. Luke ran a hand through his hair, trying to keep his anger in check. "Look, I get it. Losing a child, that kind of pain doesn't just go away. But Lily needed you. And instead of stepping up, you let her suffer." Walter swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. "I don't deserve to be her guardian." Luke seized the moment. "Then do something about it." Walter looked up, confused. "You don't want to be her guardian." Luke continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "Then sign over your rights. Let her have a real chance with someone who actually gives a damn." Walter's expression wavered. Luke pressed on. "You already abandoned her once. Don't let your guilt keep her trapped in the system." The older man exhaled shakily, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them. He looked like he was waging a war inside himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a slow nod. "What do I need to do?" "Legal battles and loopholes." The courthouse was quieter than usual when Luke walked in the next morning, Walter Parker trailing behind him like a man on his way to his own execution. The building smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Luke had spent the night working every angle, making calls, pushing through every piece of red tape he could find. The fact that Walter was voluntarily surrendering his guardianship gave them a shot, one that wouldn't have existed otherwise. But it wasn't a done deal yet. Helen Carter, the social worker, was already waiting inside the courtroom. She had a stack of papers in front of her, her sharp eyes scanning Walter with practiced scrutiny. "Mr. Parker," she said, nodding, "I assume you understand the gravity of what you're doing today." Walter swallowed hard, then nodded. "I do." Helen slid the paperwork toward him. Once you sign these forms, you will no longer have any legal claim to Lily Parker. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Walter hesitated only for a second before picking up the pen. His hand shook slightly as he signed the first page. Then the second. Then the third. With each stroke of the pen, he severed the last tie he had to his granddaughter. When it was done, he set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling shakily. Luke took the papers and handed them to Helen. Now what? Helen flipped through them, then nodded. The court will process the termination of parental rights within the next few days. After that, Lily will officially be a ward of the state. Luke clenched his jaw. That's not good enough. Helen gave him a measured look. I know what you want, Officer Callahan. But adoption is a long process, especially for a single man with a demanding job. Luke leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. I don't care how long it takes. I'll fight for her. Helen studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. I'll see what I can do. The moment of truth. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and legal hurdles. Luke barely slept, barely ate. Every moment was spent making sure no detail was overlooked, no loophole left unfilled. And then, finally, the call came. Helen's voice was unusually warm when she spoke. It's done, Luke. You've been granted emergency guardianship. Luke exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his desk. So she's mine. For now, Helen clarified. It's a temporary placement while the adoption process moves forward. But yes, she's yours. Luke ran a hand through his hair, disbelief washing over him. Thank you. Don't thank me, Helen said. Thank yourself. You did this. Luke didn't waste another second. He grabbed his keys and bolted out the door, bringing her home. The foster center was eerily quiet when Luke arrived. Lily was sitting on a cot, her small frame curled into itself. She looked up when he walked in, her dark eyes widening. Hey, kid, he said, crouching beside her. You ready to go home? Lily blinked. Home. Luke nodded. With you? A lump formed in his throat. Yeah, kid. With me. For a second, she just stared at him. Then, like a dam breaking, she flung herself into his arms. Luke caught her, his arms wrapping tightly around her tiny frame. She was shaking, her small hands gripping his jacket like she was afraid he might vanish. You're not leaving me, she whispered. He pressed a hand against her head, holding her close. Not a chance. Lily buried her face into his shoulder, and for the first time in her young life, she finally let herself believe it. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a home. She had a family. And most importantly, she had someone who wasn't going to let go. The battle for Lily. The courthouse smelled like old paper, fresh coffee, and something metallic, maybe nerves. Luke Callahan sat stiffly in one of the hard wooden chairs that lined the family courtroom, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, highlighting the dust motes floating in the air. It should have been a peaceful scene. It wasn't. Across from him, Walter Parker sat hunched in his chair, looking smaller than the last time Luke had seen him. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his worn-out flannel shirt, his gray hair still unkempt, but there was something else in his expression today, something that looked a lot like guilt. Lily wasn't in the room yet. Social services had kept her in the waiting area while the adults decided what to do with her life. It made Luke sick. The judge, an older woman with piercing blue eyes and a sharp gaze, shuffled some papers in front of her before clearing her throat. We're here today to discuss the guardianship of minor Lily Parker, she announced, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. Mr. Parker, as her legal guardian, you have filed a motion to voluntarily relinquish custody. Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tilted her head, watching him like a hawk. Would you care to explain why? Walter exhaled heavily. I can't take care of her, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I thought I could, but I wasn't ready. I let my grief take over, and I wasn't there for her the way I should have been. Luke stared at him, his jaw tightening. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Walter's gaze flickered to him before he continued. And I can't make it up to her, but he can. He jerked his chin toward Luke. The judge turned her sharp eyes to Luke. Officer Callahan, you're petitioning for emergency custody. Yes, Your Honor. On what grounds? Luke swallowed hard. Lily has no other family. She's been passed from house to house for the past 6 months. I've been with her through all of this, and I don't intend to leave her now. The judge frowned. Officer, you're a single man with a demanding career. Do you truly believe you can provide a stable home for a child? Luke sat up straighter. I've already adjusted my work schedule to daytime shifts with reduced overtime. My precinct has approved it. I have childcare arrangements, and I'm working with a caseworker to ensure I can meet all of Lily's needs. The judge's face remained impassive as she scanned his file. Your record is clean. No history of complaints or misconduct. That's reassuring. She turned to Helen Carter, the social worker. Ms. Carter, what is your professional recommendation? Helen shifted in her seat, glancing at Luke before speaking. Your Honor, I was skeptical at first, but Officer Callahan has demonstrated unwavering commitment to Lily. Since she's been with him, we've seen significant improvement in her emotional state. She's formed a strong bond with him, and, in my professional opinion, removing her now would cause unnecessary trauma. Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The judge tapped her pen against the desk, her expression unreadable. Very well, she said finally. I will grant Officer Callahan temporary custody for a probationary period of 6 months. After that, we will reevaluate for permanent adoption. Luke barely heard the rest of her words. His entire body sagged with relief. She was his, for now, and he would fight like hell to make it forever. The first night home. The air felt different. Lily sat in the back seat of Luke's car, staring at the world passing by as they drove toward his apartment. The last time she had been in this car, she had been running, cold, scared, with nowhere to go. Now she had somewhere. Someone. Luke glanced at her in the rearview mirror. You okay, kid? Lily nodded, but her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. Where will I sleep? Luke smirked. I was gonna let you pick, but Carla went ahead and decorated a room for you. Lily blinked. She did. Yep, said she didn't trust my sense of style. Lily let out a small giggle. Luke pulled into the apartment parking lot, putting the car in park before turning to look at her. Listen, kid. I know this is a big change. You don't have to pretend you're okay if you're not. Lily stared at him, as if weighing his words. Then she took a deep breath. I don't know how to be here. Luke's chest ached. We'll figure it out together. She nodded slowly, like she wanted to believe him. Inside, Luke led her down the hallway to a room at the end of the apartment. He pushed the door open, stepping aside to let her see. Lily froze. The walls were painted a soft lavender. A twin bed, covered in a pale blue comforter, sat against the wall, and stuffed animals were already waiting for her. A bookshelf stood in the corner, filled with books that Carla had picked out, just in case. There was even a small desk with art supplies. Lily stepped inside slowly, running her fingers over the bookshelf, the desk, the soft fabric of the comforter. This is, for me. Luke leaned against the doorframe. Yeah, kid, this is yours. Lily swallowed hard. I never had my own room before. Luke's throat tightened. Well, now you do. She turned to him, hesitating for a long moment before whispering, Thank you. He ruffled her hair. Get used to it, kid. The weight of a promise. That night, after dinner, mac and cheese, because Lily had insisted it was the only thing she trusted Luke to cook, he tucked her in for the first time. It felt strange. And right. Lily curled up under the blanket, clutching a stuffed bear against her chest. She looked so small, so fragile, but there was something new in her expression. Hope. Luke sat on the edge of the bed. You need anything before you sleep. Lily hesitated. Then her small voice broke the silence. Can you leave the door open? Luke's heart clenched. Of course. He stood up, moving to turn off the light when she spoke again. You won't leave, right? Luke turned back to her, his voice steady, sure. Not a chance. Lily nodded, snuggling deeper into the covers. Okay. For the first time since he met her, she closed her eyes without fear. Luke stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching her breathe. This was just the beginning. And he was never letting go. The forever home. The rain came down in slow, steady drops, tapping against the window pane like a quiet melody. Luke Callahan stood in the small kitchen of his apartment, staring at the steaming mug of coffee in his hands, his mind miles away. It had been 6 months. 6 months since he had found Lily curled up in the backseat of his patrol car, a tiny figure swallowed by the night. 6 months since he had walked into a system that didn't care, fought against rules designed to keep kids moving from one temporary home to another. 6 months of proving, to the courts, to the system, and maybe even to himself, that he was the one who would stay. And today was the final hearing. If all went well, by the end of the day, Lily Parker wouldn't just be a girl he had rescued from the cold. She would be Lily Callahan, his daughter, forever. A soft shuffle of footsteps broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Lily standing in the hallway, her hair still a mess of tangled curls, her eyes heavy with sleep. She wore the oversized t-shirt he had gotten her a few months ago, the one that read Future Detective in bold letters across the front. Morning, kid, he greeted, forcing himself to sound normal. You sleep okay? Lily nodded but didn't say anything right away. Instead, she moved closer and wrapped her small arms around his middle, pressing her face against his side. Luke froze for a second before carefully setting his coffee down on the counter. Then, without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Lily wasn't big on hugs. She still flinched sometimes when people moved too quickly. But moments like this, they made all the fights, all the paperwork, all the sleepless nights worth it. Are we gonna win today? She mumbled against his shirt. Luke swallowed hard. We better. Otherwise, I might have to kidnap you. Lily giggled, a real unguarded sound that made his chest feel tight. You'd be a terrible criminal, she pointed out. Luke smirked. You think? She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her big brown eyes filled with something that looked a lot like trust. Yeah, you're too much of a cop. Luke laughed, ruffling her hair. Fair point, kid. Go get dressed. We've got a big day ahead. Lily nodded and padded back to her room, leaving Luke standing there, his hands resting on the counter, his heart thudding harder than it had on any high-risk call he had ever responded to. This was it. Today, she became his. No more temporary guardianship, no more probationary periods. Just his. Forever. The final battle. The family courtroom looked the same as it had 6 months ago. Too big, too quiet, too cold. The same high ceilings, the same thick curtains hanging over the windows, filtering in dull sunlight. But today felt different. Today, Luke sat beside Lily at the long wooden table, her small hand gripping his under the surface. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a blue dress that matched her favorite blanket at home, the one Luke had given her that first night at the precinct. She had insisted on braiding her own hair, and it was slightly lopsided, but he hadn't had the heart to fix it. It was her. Judge Eleanor Whitmore sat at the front of the courtroom, her sharp eyes scanning the paperwork in front of her. She had been a tough but fair presence throughout this case, and Luke knew, without a doubt, that her decision today would be final. Helen Carter, the social worker, sat at the opposite table, her clipboard resting on her lap. Her face was unreadable, But Luke had come to respect her over these past months. She wasn't the enemy. She had fought alongside him when it counted. Walter Parker was absent. He had disappeared months ago, signing away his rights and vanishing from Lily's life. It was for the best, but Luke knew Lily still thought about him sometimes. The judge finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Officer Callahan, you have been Lily Parker's legal guardian for the past 6 months. Do you still wish to proceed with permanent adoption?" Luke didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. Absolutely." The judge turned to Lily, and for the first time, her sharp gaze softened slightly. "Lily, do you want to be adopted by Officer Callahan?" Lily squeezed Luke's hand, her voice strong despite her small size. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to stay with him." The judge nodded and leaned back slightly, scanning over the paperwork once more. "Miss Carter, does the department have any objections?" Helen shook her head. "No, Your Honor. Officer Callahan has provided Lily with a stable home and has demonstrated an undeniable commitment to her well-being." Luke felt Lily relax slightly beside him. The judge studied them both for a long moment before finally speaking. "Very well. Having reviewed all documentation and testimonies, and finding all requirements met satisfactorily, I hereby grant the petition for adoption. Lily Parker will henceforth be known as Lily Callahan." Silence. Then a whisper from Lily. "That's me." Luke barely had time to register what had happened before Lily turned in her seat and launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face against his chest. Luke held onto her tightly, his throat closing up as he whispered, "Yeah, kid. That's you." Helen Carter smiled from across the table. The judge's gavel hit the desk, but the sound barely registered. It was done. She was his. Forever. Home. That night, Luke tucked Lily into bed, the glow in the dark stars they had put on her ceiling casting soft green light across the room. "You good, kid?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Lily nodded, but then hesitated. "Can you stay for a little bit?" Luke smirked. "You just like delaying bedtime." She giggled, scooting over on the bed. "Maybe." Luke sat down beside her, watching as she traced patterns on the blanket with her fingertips. After a long moment, she spoke. "I used to be scared of bedtime," she admitted quietly. "When I was at Grandpa's, I never knew if I'd wake up in the same place. I always thought I'd get sent somewhere else." Luke clenched his fists against his knees. "That's never gonna happen again, Lily." She looked up at him. "Promise." Luke swallowed hard. Then, with every ounce of certainty in his body, he answered, "Yeah, kid. I promise." She studied him for a moment, then nodded, satisfied. "Okay." He reached out and ruffled her hair, standing up to leave, but before he could go, she spoke again. "Good night, Dad." Luke froze. It was the first time she had ever said it. The word wrapped around his chest, squeezed his heart in a way that nothing else ever had. "Good night, kid," he whispered, his voice thick. He left the door open just a crack, just the way she liked it. And as he walked back down the hallway, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, his home wasn't just a place anymore. It was a person, and her name was Lily Callahan.